For the third paper, now before we looked into teacher beliefs, and now the second paper we looked really at the school level and how that is also very important when it comes to student achievement. But in the third paper, we're going to look at the link between the students' achievement and how the teacher uses the assessment practices. And that paper is going to be presented by Serafina Pastore. And she's an associate professor in the Department of Education and Psychology Communication at the University of Bari. And this is Gianluca, Argentin, and he's a sociologist, and you're working at the University of Milan.
Thank you for this introduction, very tight, because this is what we have tried to do with this presentation. Hi, everybody. The conceptual framework of this, not research, it is a attempt of research, is to put together two different perspectives. One is the mine, of course, and one is yours, because we have two different disciplinary backgrounds. So the first is on assessment literacy and data literacy, and more specifically on teacher training and teacher education in the field of educational assessment. And the second one is related to the topic of my colleague, that is on the analysis of and the influence and impact of different variables on student learning. And there is another topic that has tried to link our perspective in this case, and is the attempt to reflect on these two topics, considering three different levels: the educational policy, the educational research, because we are researchers, and the third, the last one, is about the impact on teaching practice. So this is a brief overview of our paper, so I think that we can move on. And we know that over the last 20 years, the concept of assessment has been one of the hottest topics in the educational research. And we move from the idea of assessment is a key policy lever for the improvement of school system, not only in Italy, but worldwide. And the idea that the improvement is like a mantra in some way has been related to also the idea that the improvement, it's not only on the educational policy level, but has to be considered also in the practical aspect of teachers in their daily classroom activities. And assessment in this perspective has been considered, as to pool curriculum and pedagogy in terms of the tendency of teachers to reorient or change their practices. And the inner idea is to improve at the end, not only the student performances of the student achievement, but the entire school system. When we talk about assessment, we talk about many different, doesn't work? Okay. Many different aspects, such as you can see in this slide, different kind of understanding of what is considered in terms of assessment and also learning. Because when we consider this binomial, there are different methods, different practices that has to be considered, and also different level of data that can be achieved in terms of student learning. And it has been considered, but it is just cited a lot of times during this session, the concept, for example, of formative assessment, that is not the magician that a teacher can do in terms of learning for teacher, but of students, but requires kind of competencies in terms of what has to be done in terms to assure the quality of this kind of assessment. But also, for example, the idea of using the large scale assessment data for the improvement of the school system. The idea of moving on the alignment of, oops, my mistakes. Here we go. Okay. Okay, has led to consider, for example, the concept of the alignment with the national curriculum standards, and the idea of design what are evaluation processes, considering the usefulness and the usability of data. That's why the question that I've done before, in terms of what has to be done in terms of teaching practices. And the idea of using data has become one of the most important aspects in this last, I think, couple of years due to the COVID. But before, we have a lot of pressure in terms of the evidence-based approach, moving from the US context, and the idea that teachers with data on hands have to be done something, and that they have to use this data in terms of the improvement of their teaching instruction or about what is to consider for student learning. This is why one of the main aspects in terms of assessment has led to focus on these 3-4 main aspects that I pointed in the slide. You know, the idea that assessment should support student learning and improve student learning. The idea that we need, this is one of the most interesting aspects in terms of research, understand how teachers practice assessment in vivo, in the classroom, and more specifically, also formative assessment. That's one of the most challenging things in this perspective. And this is one of the concepts that I'm studying in this moment, the concept of teacher assessment literacy. What are the components of assessment literate, and how we can support teachers to become assessment literate, not only in terms of the only using data, but also to support also the improvement of the school system. And then the perspective of teacher education and professional development on the educational assessment. The concept of assessment literacy has become very important over the last 20 years, and moving from the original idea of assessment literacy is only related to what a teacher realizes in the classroom, has moved toward the idea of something that is related to the school improvement. Nothing now. Okay. So what has been found by the research on this topic? Despite the increased interest in terms of policy education and on national standards, for example, in Italy, we have now professional standards, but in other countries, the ideas of highlight clearly what a teacher has to care when we talk about assessment in the classroom is widespread. Started to consider the idea that professional development has to be designed in a specific way when we talk about assessment literacy. However, as you see, despite the interest and despite very great investments in terms of policymakers, one of the expressions that Rick Stiggins used is the assessment illiteracy abounds. We have a lot of illiteracy when we talk about educational assessment for teachers. And therefore, it would be very interesting. That's why our our paper this afternoon to highlight what kind of practices and strategies teachers use when we talk about assessment in the classroom. For this, we have considered the teacher questionnaire of the INVALSI, and more specifically, the question about the teacher assessment practices. And we found something that I think would be very interesting in terms, as I told you, not only in terms of educational research, but also in educational policy.
Thank you. Okay. Yes, we focused on two research questions. The first one is, as already Serafina said, what are the practices that teachers use when assessing? And we focused on the impact of these practices on students' performance. The second research question we focused on is instead on the impact of having attended professional development on assessment, teachers having attended professional development on assessment, again on their students' learning. For these purposes, we use the data INVALSI dataset of 2017-18. We focus here on grade 5, and we focus on the main sample in order to have the data linkage between teachers and pupils. I don't know why I don't see my table here. You don't see it too? Okay. This may be a relevant problem if it works also with the results. May I check, please? No, okay. At least with the results, we do not have any problem. Okay, that's fine. Not as bad as it seemed. Okay, here you could see the sample size. You are not seeing it at all, but we rely on a large sample size of pupils and on a large sample size of teachers. And we have about 2/3 of the sample, of the main sample, where it is possible to connect pupils and teachers, both for Italian and mathematics. And we have 865 couples of teachers, meaning that for those classes, both Italian and math teachers answer the questionnaire. And this subsample is particularly relevant for our analysis. As Serafina said, we focus on the self-declared practices of assessment that teachers filled in the questionnaire. And we decided to focus on the practices that are usual among teachers, meaning the one that they declare to use always or mainly. And we focus also on a single item regarding previous professional development in the 2 years before the assessment, where teachers were asked to tell whether they attended courses on assessment. Here we have a problem because the item is not clearly focused on assessment practices or national assessment. So we are capturing both elements in one item. We run 2 sets of models. The first one is usual standard OLS regression models. The second one instead, and we will call these results net associations in the model, in the presentation, net association models in the presentation. The second one instead is labeled as effects. And in this case, we use the fact that we have a couple of teachers, and we are able to use a fixed effect, a student's fixed effect model, meaning that all the students' characteristics are under control in this second set of models. As you can see in the second part of this slide, we have a bunch of control variables in the net association models, both at students and teachers level. And clearly, we do not control for the covariate at students level when we are using the fixed effect students model. The advantage of using the fixed effect students model is that we can rely on larger internal validity. On the other side, we are losing a huge amount of the sample. I will show you something more on this. The big advantage of using the net association is that we can rely on the larger subsample of respondents. I said that we lose a lot of pupils because, especially if you look at the more common practices, an example using written examinations to assess pupils, this kind of activity is done by the vast majority of both math and Italian teachers. So in that case, comparing the couples of teachers that fall in the situation where one of them use the practice and the other one doesn't is quite rare. But this kind of problem is not present if you look, for example, at the use of online tools, because in that case, it is quite common to have one that is using the online tools to assess teachers, to assess pupils, and the other one is not doing it. I want to show you also a descriptive fact about the practices that teachers use, which is that they are pretty similar in primary schools for math and Italian. Teachers declare to do the same things with the same frequency. I also stress another descriptive result here, which is that professional development on assessment, with the double meaning that we already named before, is not so common among teachers. It involved 1 teacher out of 5 in the previous 2 years. So results. Here you see the 4 assessment practices that teachers declare to do regularly and that we found do not have an impact on pupils' performance. Do not have an impact means that we are finding tiny associations or tiny effect when we move to the fixed effect models. And frequently, as you can see, also the sign of this association is not in the same direction. So having attended professional development seems not relevant to produce an impact on pupils' performance, such as using textbook tests, workgroup on oral examinations. Then there is a second subset of behaviors, teachers' behaviors, that are the one displayed here, where you see that when you see the green color, it means that there is a positive effect. When you see the red one, it means that there is a negative effect. And in this case, in all these cases, we are quite unsure about what the effect is, meaning that if we look at the net associations, it seems that a lot of practices have an impact. Instead, if we look at the effects, which is the most rigorous causal inference we can do on the data, we see that only not planned oral examinations have a positive impact, which is not neglectable in terms of size. Finally, there are 2 behaviors that instead are clearly associated with the pupils' performance and that we can say may more trustable being considered as a cause of pupils' achievement, which are the use of online tools, which is the less used practice in our sample, but the most effective one, and the use of self-made standardized tests from teachers, which have a positive impact. So summing up and concluding, it seems that testing improves students' achievement because in both cases, the use of online tools such as Moodle or Kahoot or similar tests and the use of self-made standardized tests are pointing in the direction of testing improving achievement. But we are quite skeptical in labeling this as teaching to the test. It seems more a socialization to the test, especially the fact that pupils have higher impacts with the use of online tools, which are mainly games, seems that reduced the impact, they reduced probably the anxiety of teachers or students during the test. They are more suitable with the testing moment. Second, it seems that also not planned oral examinations seems to improve students' performance, which is something that we expected in terms of rigor of the evaluation. At the other time, we saw that all the other assessment did not display any impact and not even being professionally developed on these topics. Further steps, we are going now to expand the analysis to the 8th grade and to accumulate 2 years in order to have more reliable estimates of our associations and impacts. And we are also going to extend the control variables at teachers level, because at the moment we did not use any measure of teacher digital skills or teachers digital behavior. That may be something relevant when we look at the effect of the online tools. And finally, the idea is to come back to the independent variables and try to combine them in styles of assessment in order to have not the impact of the tiny impact of every single practice, but the impact of combined practices. That's it. Thank you.
Thank you so much for the very insightful presentation and the nice results too. So I guess with these results that maybe the audience has some questions here in the...
I think. Oops, sorry.
Okay, we will maybe repeat the question in the microphone for the ones online.
What do you mean by self-made standardized tests?
We don't mean that teachers have systematically realized standardized tests, because considering the practice that are also spread in the Italian school system at the moment, we consider use of previous INVALSI tests, or sometimes also, commercial standardized tests that are so used in our country.
Okay, any other questions? Yes, there is another question here on site.
Okay. So thank you for your interesting presentation, very insightful. I was wondering, how are you planning to disentangle the effect of the assessment from the effect of teaching practices? Because teachers who use certain kind of assessments might also be the teachers that actually use different teaching practices, teaching methodologies. And so we don't know whether the effect, this could be the effect of the, of the assessment or the teaching.
It is a good question. Thank you, Dalit. We have a bunch of self-reported teaching practices. We did not work in that direction for this presentation, but in the same questionnaire, there is also a bunch of practices that teacher may perform. It is clearly another control variable that we can add in the model, but I'm not sure that with just 1 year, we may have enough variability in the data to control also for that predictor. So the idea to extend the control variables, but at the same time, adding up 2 waves is going in that direction. Thank you.
Okay. Other questions in the room? We still have quite some time. Maybe questions online? No, people online are very silent. So all the online participation is not working in this seminar. But I maybe still have a question for you. I, by the way, like the socialization to the test. I think you should you should do something with that. When you could add maybe questions yourself just for this study. Looking into maybe these practices, assessment practices of teachers, what would it be? Which questions would it be? I know it's a very general question, but you might have a hint in like the variability. Yeah, I don't know.
I mean, if we may have the possibility to add items to the future question.
Yes, like future questions.
That's a nice question. Didn't think about it previously. You are the expert. Come
on. Okay. Add other questions. I think it would be interesting in terms, for example, one of the fancy pedagogical aspect is the formative assessment that, for example, for the primary school, I think should be more considerate, because you can know this and tell you, but since 2020 there has been another educational reform in Italy, and there is a strong commitment to the use of formative assessment for this kind of school. Maybe teacher practice will be changed again, we don't know this. It's sure that the items in the questions should be reviewed and update, maybe in this perspective. Also because in terms of formative assessment, we found only one that is related to the use of rubric, for example, but all the other are, it's not the correct expression, but traditional assessment practices. So we have to consider also the change and the improvements in this perspective. Absolutely, yeah.
Yes, the other thing I would add is something about the practices that teachers may introduce in order to avoid biases in assessing students, because we have a bunch now of evidence showing that there are inequalities and biases in the way that teachers assess, and probably trying to understand to what extent teachers are self-aware of their biases and are introducing in their assessment practices tricks to avoid to be biased, such as hiding the name of the students you are assessing, may be something interesting to learn.
I didn't think of that myself, but I think, yeah, that would be a very nice addition, actually. Great.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. And I think, yeah, another applause.